Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to session 695, Envisioning the Future of Low-Carbon Resilient Communities, Key Ingredients of a Just, Inclusive Transition. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the history of the land where I work. The University of Waterloo is situated on the Haldeman Tract, land that was promised to the Six Nations of the Grand River, land within the territory of the Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. Some of our panelists are joining from other locales, but regardless of the exact location, increasingly Canadians are coming to understand how our history is tied to policies of expulsion, assimilation, and abuse of Indigenous peoples during the time of settlement and confederation and since. We have a responsibility to acknowledge and understand this history, these truths, and the current experiences of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, and for this understanding to inform the work that we do. I'm thrilled to be chairing this panel today. My name is Jean Andre, and I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Environment at the University of Waterloo, and we have 5 amazing panelists with us today. As the title of the session indicates, for the next 75 minutes, we will focus on a just, inclusive transition toward a low-carbon future. Now, we know that the ambitions that are set out in the Paris Agreement and other commitments, including Bill C-12, cannot be achieved without transformative change. And there's no one singular pathway to achieve this needed change. While the cost of unbridled climate change vastly outstrips any estimate of the costs of the needed transition, some sectors and communities will bear a larger share of the burden of this transition. In a just transition, the costs of climate change mitigation are shared, rather than placed heavily on marginalized communities and those workers in the sectors that must undergo the most rapid, the deepest, and the longest lasting change. These communities can and must be beneficiaries of the transition rather than just collateral damage. In this panel, we will encourage a diversity of provocative interventions on accelerated transitions to net zero, followed by targeted questions and an open discussion. Ultimately, the goal is to expose and explore co-benefits and trade-offs inherent in this transition and consider the ways that evidence-based policy might facilitate a just and inclusive approach to deep decarbonization in Canada. And of course, like we do for all the sessions, we welcome you to add your questions. So a very brief introduction then of our 5 panelists. Sarah Birch is an associate professor in the Department of Geography and Environmental Management at the University of Waterloo, as well as the executive director of the university's Interdisciplinary Center on Climate Change. Graham Reed is of mixed Anishinaabe and European descent, and he works at the Assembly of First Nations as a senior policy advisor. Rachel Sampson is the Clean Growth Research Director at the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices. Mary Pickering has 30 years of experience in the environmental nonprofit sector. Mary is currently senior advisor to the Atmospheric Fund and Low Carbon Cities Canada. And Manvi Bala is a PhD student at UBC who is passionate about health system reform and policy, climate mitigation, and adaptation in the healthcare sector. We're going to begin with Sarah. Sarah holds a Canada Research Chair in Sustainability, Governance, and Innovation. She's a lead author of the 6th Assessment Report of the IPCC, and she's an expert in transformative responses to climate change at the community scale.
Thank you, Jean. I'm so glad to be here today, and I really look forward to this conversation, hearing the interventions from the other panelists, and the question and answer period, of course, from the audience. I think that'll be really vibrant, I'm sure. So I'd like to begin with a couple of comments about the work that I'm doing that informs my perspective on just transitions and the challenges that lay ahead of us when it comes to moving to zero and resilient Canada. And so, as Jean mentioned, one fairly absorbing chunk of work is with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And with that international body of scientists, I do work on mitigation, on greenhouse gas reduction, trying to understand the state of the art, the state of the science on the challenge that lies ahead when it comes to decarbonization. Simultaneously, here in Canada, I'm very happy to co-chair an expert advisory table along with Natural Resources Canada and Environment and Climate Change Canada that feeds into the National Adaptation Strategy. So for me, I am continuously moving back and forth between the worlds of greenhouse gas reduction, of decarbonization, and of adaptation, responding to those climate change impacts that are unfolding even as we speak, and understanding what the underlying drivers of vulnerability are, and also the underlying drivers of high emissions pathways. So I always tend to cut across those worlds of adaptation and mitigation. And I think at this current moment in Canada, we're called to do both better and faster and simultaneously. We have set these and ambitious net zero by 2050 greenhouse gas reduction targets. But meanwhile, we're seeing in BC, of course, the flooding that's unfolding now, just months after the heat dome in the summer, the loss of life, the loss to property and natural ecosystems that are unfolding right now. So we have, and nationally, when it's reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, clearly have emergent and urgent obligations when it comes to climate change adaptation. And so therefore, we find ourselves in a place of progress on both quickly and in a way that distributes the costs and the benefits of transitioning to a more resilient, low carbon economy more equitably than they are being distributed right now. So I think that, the important next step for us collectively is to actively seek synergies between those two streams of action, rather than just sort of crossing our fingers and hoping that they emerge accidents. We need to seek them, we need to cultivate them, we need to communicate their value. So this is the lay of the land as I would describe it on the urgency between adaptation and mitigation. So just to move on in the last couple of minutes of my initial intervention, talk about those ingredients of a just transition as I see them. I think that there's a long list and I'm really interested to hear what the others have to say. But the first that I would start with is, I think for too long, we have been having a conversation about what we're trying to move, what we're trying to transition away from, and not enough of a conversation about what we're trying to transition towards. What is the vision of the future that we are collectively pulling towards and lifting each other up to? And there's a couple of things I would just highlight about that vision. One is that there isn't just one. There should never be, there can never be just one vision of what a sustainable, resilient, low carbon community should look like. There needs to be diversity in that vision. And so there needs to be a diverse range of folks involved in crafting that vision. As Jean mentioned, I'm the same land that she is, traditional Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and neutral peoples. There are voices that are unheard in the climate change discussion, in the discussion around the implications of this transition for justice. And nowhere is that more relevant than when we talk about the just transition. I think towards needs to be more inclusive and also more adaptable. Our values will shift as we move into the future. Impacts of climate change will become clearer as they are, and so that needs to be adaptable. So a more compelling vision, inclusion of a wider range of actors, I think is an important element of that just transition so that we get more creative, more inclusive solutions to climate change challenges rather than a very narrow set. And some of this has to do with, I think, in terms of understanding what's ahead of us and why it matters, is shifting our conversation away from one of costs, the costs of adaptation, the costs of decarbonization, and towards what we are investing in our communities. We're investing in the resilience of our society and our economy. And the costs of decarbonization and adaptation, of course, pale in comparison when we stack them up against the costs of unbridled climate change. There are a suite of specific actions that I think are necessary as ingredients of that just transition. And many of us are familiar with some of them, but I think we are moving on to this place where we need to have more tangible conversations around them, long and transparent timelines when it comes to this planning, programs for skills development, upskilling and reskilling so that folks whose livelihoods are reliant on extractive sectors can move into renewable and sustainable sectors. Industrial policies that actively cultivate economic education so that those can be shared, and of course, support for the marginalized communities. So those are just some of the issues that come into play for me when I explore the ingredients of just transition and the imperative that is pushing us to have this conversation. And I'll stop there and pass it to my colleague.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Sarah. Some good things to think about. And, when you talk about, I really like the point you make about investment, because when I think about how we built this country, whether it was social infrastructure or it was physical infrastructure, we actually focused on investment, not on cost. So I thought that was very powerful. Our second speaker is Graham Reed. And Graham's work at the Assembly of First Nation focuses on ensuring federal and international climate policy safeguards for First Nations rights, jurisdiction, and knowledge. He's also a PhD candidate at the University of Guelph, an Action Canada Fellow, and a top 30 under 30 in sustainability. Welcome, Graham.
Rich, Jean, and Anine Bojo, Graham Reed, Indigenous Cause, Ottawa, Nonjiba, Anishinaabe, and Dow. It's an honor to join this virtual circle with all of you and to share some early reflections from Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh lands, what's currently known as Vancouver. And appreciate you, Jean, just opening us in an appropriate way and acknowledgement. And, I'd be remiss not to acknowledge the ongoing devastation and continued devastation likely projected as a result of multiple atmospheric rivers coupled by the heat dome, as well as the fires that have occurred, and very real impacts of climate and a changing climate. Also today, many of you likely have followed this as the first speech from the throne by Governor General Mary Simon, the first Inuk Governor General, and want to acknowledge, as I sit on a panel of strong women, that the role of rematriation and then that centrality within our conversation as we dismantle patriarchy within all aspirations of our efforts. And to Sarah's points, I guess just sharing a bit of background and then responding to some of the ways in which we can frame this conversation might be fruitful. So as Jean mentioned, at the AFN, I've been there for the last 5, coming up on 6 years, and do a variety of different things, which is also, I have the distinct pleasure of chairing another one of those advisory bodies on the National Adaptation Strategy with a colleague at Environment and Climate Change Canada. I'm also leading, in conjunction with some incredible scholars, the development of what's currently being characterized as the Indigenous Resilience Report, which is a standalone report alongside the Canadian National Climate Assessment, which is to our earlier reflections, the Canadian equivalent of the IPCC. And so have some really incredible conversations based on how do we think about and how do we reframe these conversations in a way that align with First Nations worldviews, but also align with the underlining factors driving the point of crisis and the imbalance that our elders speak to. And so I think I'd start, and I appreciate Sarah's framing of transition towards, because my first reflection is, often when thinking about just transition, we need to think about just transition to what? And part of that, in my mind, is being critical about the characterization of and conceptualization of net zero as an end state, right? That we're looking to arrive at this point where we can offset the anthropogenic contributions of greenhouse gases. And I think that's not the best approach. I think really what net zero should be aimed as, and some of the principles and ingredients that Sarah had framed, and I'm sure my other panelists will frame, is that characterization of net zero as a process. And I've spoken to this earlier in many different areas, but really I see that as a process of being towards a future of more just, equitable, resilient for all of our future little ones. And I think one of the contributions that Indigenous peoples bring to the conversation on just transition is the extension of that transition towards also honoring our responsibility and our connection with the land around us, as well as our more than human relatives. And to me, really that frames, and there's been quite successful conversations in a climate fellowship hosted by AFN Yukon around framing climate action as reconnection. Reconnection to land, reconnection to spirit, reconnection to language, and reconnection to each other. And I think in my mind that takes the kind of focus of just transition and extends it to how do we centralize people making that future better and thinking about those relationships that we have with the land and with those around us. And to one of Sarah's points that really stuck out in my mind is the tendency to associate a just transition with the retraining of current workers within oil and gas. And I think, there's been a lot of really incredible work to think about how do we frame that, not exclusively about responding to, a changing economy, but also about the opportunities. And I think one thing that's often missed in those conversations is the opportunities presented to Indigenous youth and how we can think about those underemployed and underemployed youth as central pillars to moving that conversation to a just transition forward. And I guess I conclude with one reflection, and one of the things that we're leading at the AFN is the development of an AFN National Climate Strategy. And part of the main conceptual and theoretical framework is something we're calling the First Nations Climate Lens. And what the First Nations Climate Lens does is, to the earlier point, it really challenges that dichotomization, that false dichotomization between mitigation and adaptation, and really removes climate from being this abstract thing, instead rather an issue that we look at through and understand the compounding and magnifying impacts of those root causes. And for many First Nations, we identify those root causes that are driving these imbalances as things like the ongoing legacy of colonization. And to the point about inclusion, we also need to think about how are we not indirectly reproducing structural power imbalances? How are we thinking about the roles in which these things manifest, these structural racism that manifests in our society within the processes that we're developing? How do we consider the extractive tendencies of capitalism as unproductive for the future that we want, moving away from that mentality of scarcity and accumulation towards cooperation, the gift economy, and working together? And ultimately, how do we also focus this conversation, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later, away from this kind of central focus on carbon, and really about all of these co-benefits that are advanced in the pursuit of climate justice as it relates to Indigenous justice and disability justice and gender justice, and as well as racial justice. And I think those are central points to this process that we're walking on together. So I'll stop there, Chimigwich.
Graham, and there's lots that you said that stuck with me, but I really like the idea of being critical of net zero, or as an end state. And it speaks, I think, to the way in which our relationships with our planet and with each other haven't been healthy in many ways, and for a very long time. And as you say, it's a process that we look at as in terms of the change. Okay, our third speaker then, I'm happy to welcome Rachel Sampson from the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices. She's been working on climate change policy in the intersection of environmental and economic policy for over 20 years as a consultant, and also with various federal government departments. And so it's wonderful to have you join us, Rachel.
Thanks, Jean. So when we think about identifying the key ingredients for just transition, we need to start by understanding what transition could look like for Canada, including both risks and opportunities. Following new commitments at the recent International Climate Summit, we now have countries representing 90% of global GDP committed to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by mid-century. This implies that a profound change to global markets is underway, regardless of Canadian policy. In our recent report titled Sink or Swim, we analyzed the implications of global low-carbon transition for Canada's economy. We stress-tested publicly traded companies under different transition scenarios and assessed impacts to their profitability. What we found is that many of Canada's exporting and multinational companies are not yet ready for transition. Without significant investments and transformation, they will see lower profitability. Around 70% of Canada's goods exports are in sectors that are vulnerable to market disruption. This has important implications for Canadian workers. Over 800,000 Canadians work in these transition vulnerable sectors. If their employers fail to adapt to new market realities, there could be job loss. Even if facilities don't close, companies could lay off workers as they struggle to stay competitive. The situation could be particularly difficult in communities that depend on transition vulnerable sectors. We identified 55 communities that had more than 3% of their workforce employed in at least one transition vulnerable sector. Vulnerable communities can face cascading impacts, where the closure of a major employer can lead to losses in service jobs and migration out of the community that then creates fiscal challenges for the local government and leads to more job loss. At the same time, we should recognize that transition is not all negative. There will be global and Canadian market opportunities as governments and companies seek to reduce emissions and shift to clean energy and low carbon goods. The best thing that can be done for workers and communities is for Canada's economy to succeed through transition. Existing companies need to become transition ready. For some, like iron and steel or chemicals, that will mean reducing emissions. For others, like oil and gas and auto manufacturing, it will mean moving into new business lines, like clean hydrogen or electric vehicles. Economic success also requires the growth of new companies that can capture growing global market opportunities. We found over 500 Canadian companies active in markets expected to experience significant growth through transition. But many of them still struggle to obtain the financing they need to scale up and compete globally. And even if Canada's economy ultimately succeeds in aggregate, there could be individuals and communities that face significant challenges through market and labor force disruption. When we look at workers, the most vulnerable will be the least educated, as well as Indigenous peoples and visible minorities that face discrimination in hiring practices. Those with lower levels of education, and particularly those that have not finished high school or have no post-secondary education, are most likely to be unemployed and are more likely to lose their job in a recession. The combined forces of global low-carbon transition, digitization, and automation are also leading to increased demand for highly skilled workers. While 88% of people in Canada have a high school diploma, the number remains stubbornly low for First Nations youth, at only 41% on reserve and 68% off reserve. Children of parents who did not complete post-secondary education are less likely to complete post-secondary education themselves and are more than twice as likely to drop out of high school. We also know that in some provinces and territories, Indigenous peoples and visible minorities are overrepresented in transition vulnerable sectors. At the national level, 10% of Indigenous males are employed in natural resource sectors versus 6% of non-Indigenous males. In Manitoba, for example, 10% of employees in transition vulnerable sectors are Indigenous and 23% are visible minorities. Discrimination in hiring practices could make it harder for these workers to find new employment if they lose their job. Certain communities could also struggle if their primary employer lays off workers and they are unable to attract new investment. Many of these communities could be in rural or remote areas where it is more difficult to diversify economies. There are also communities that may not be dependent on transition vulnerable sectors, but already struggle with high levels of unemployment. This includes several communities in Atlantic Canada, as well as many Indigenous communities. A just transition requires a focus on supporting economic success, improving the resilience of the workforce through education and skills, and helping vulnerable communities attract new sources of investment and job growth. Governments at all levels can play an important role in smoothing the transition for workers and communities across Canada. They can put in place policies and targeted financial supports that help ensure Canada's economy succeeds. They can also invest in workforce resilience, supporting skills retraining, as well as better educational outcomes for youth. And they can empower communities to capture transition opportunities through infrastructure investment, project financing, and capacity building. Overall, there's a lot that can be done to help Canada have a just and smooth transition going forward.
Thank you very much, Rachel. I really appreciate you bringing some elements to the discussion that that I think are complementary to what we've heard. You talked quite a bit about the geography of vulnerability and opportunity, and also the generational aspects. And I think those are all really critical elements as well as we think about a just and inclusive transition. So thank you so much for those comments. Okay, our fourth speaker today is Mary Pickering. Her current work is focused on urban climate action while generating equitable community benefits. Mary is an experienced program designer and leader of collective impacts and partnerships initiatives, co-directing development of the City of Toronto's Transform TO Climate Plan and participating as a founder of the Low Carbon Cities Canada initiative. Welcome to the panel, Mary.
Thank you, Jean. I just, one nice thing about coming forth is I get to absorb all the interesting information that came before. And I guess one thing that comes to mind for me in this topic is how multifaceted this question is, and how we're going to need to work it on so many different levels. And maybe one of the challenges is understanding how the component parts will fit together. So I'm thinking about that. In terms of things I wanted to share with you today, they're really coming out of some experience that I've had over the last year in my work. First of all, in trying to redefine elements of success for Low Carbon Cities Canada, which we are doing in a way that includes and as key performance indicators, designing for co-benefits and equity, which is something that's quite new. And to be honest, I don't think we know how to do it, but we're going to try and learn. And this is, I think we join a lot of other thinkers right now in realizing that climate action is a bit too narrow a definition, and we need to think about the connections with other kinds of aspects of the work. Also, we've recently received a report from the TAF-funded, Toronto, the Atmospheric Fund funded, about some work done by community leaders in Toronto over the last 2 years. And I wanted to share some insights from those community leaders, really about activating the grassroots. And in terms of my ingredients I wanted to talk about today, that's the first one. This climate conversation is missing a lot of people. And this is contributing to polarization of public opinion, which is very dangerous, I think, for advancing solutions. How can we make this topic more relevant for more people? How can we make it reflect their experience, their concerns, in order to broaden, to redesign the policies and build the support we need to lift up a number of different goals? And my research question in here are, what are the best practices in grassroots mobilizing for climate action for just transition? Be interesting to see what people are doing and to be scanning that. My second ingredient is how we need to be forefronting community concerns. It's really related to this grassroots issue, keeping community concerns at the forefront of solution building and decision making. That means we kind of have to learn how to do this multi-solving, you know, like we're looking for climate action, but we have to have synergistic integrated responses. That means they're designed to do more than one thing. We're not bolting on interesting co-benefits opportunities onto climate action ideas we've already decided on. We have to think about this from the beginning. It takes longer to do this. We have to work with others, and it kind of defies our current way of organizing government and policy making, structure, because we work in departments and divisions that look at issues individually. So it requires institutional innovation. And I guess my question here would be, it'd be great to track and document progress on projects that are taking this multi-solving approach and how they're transcending this habit we have in the past of organizing policy decision making in different silos. And finally, I think very important is a need to strengthen partnership capacity. These complex issues, they just can't be resolved without having connections across different types of sectors. And that's very difficult work. This kind of partnership is hard to manage. We're working across with people we don't necessarily know, understand, different cultures. Listen, we all talk about this, but I can tell you that I don't think there's a lot of great work in this area and that we need to build the capacity to do this better. It's going to be central. Just in terms of the question of who should be leading this process, I think this is going to be need, as I said in my first reflection, this is going to require multifaceted, multi-level leadership. But in terms of this grassroots area, I want to refer to a little bit later the experience we're having in Toronto on a current project. But I'd be asking, how might we strengthen and leverage existing bench strength that exists within our community groups to lead engagement, enable participation, cultivate diverse leadership, and co-create policy solutions. These local groups that we have of different types, I will call them social infrastructure components, and maybe I can elaborate on that a bit later. They have the way to engage people in climate action conversations that are relevant to community concerns, and to, that's my alarm, and to systematically build more capacity for community resilience, especially in neighborhoods and communities that are the most resilient. So I look forward to exploring that a bit more with you in later comments. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Marion. Thank you for highlighting the importance of the local. I think, we have to think about this in different scales. And you also threw out some big challenges for us, trying to build capacity for partnerships and build capacity for institutions to innovate. These are big challenges, and thank you for highlighting those. Our fifth speaker is Manvi Bala. In addition to her role as a researcher, Manvi has been a community leader for more than a decade. She is president and co-founder of Shake Up the Establishment, which is dedicated to increasing literacy on climate and environmental science. And she's also director and co-founder of Misinformed, an inclusive, diverse, and equitable health education nonprofit. Welcome to the panel, Manvi.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm calling in from the ancestral and present day unceded territory of the Musqueam. I know, Graham, you touched on some of the situations that are climate exacerbated here in what is currently British Columbia with respect to the atmospheric rivers. I actually drove through one of the first tornadoes in decades. It was actually so scary. So definitely feeling it here more than I would have felt it in Ontario, where my family is, and seeing it with the floods and everything that's going on here. So this is definitely a very topical conversation that's happening. And will continue to be, unfortunately, increasingly topical as we go forward from here. As mentioned, I'm grateful to be offered this space today as both a scholar and a community organizer to share my thought on climate futures. To me, in large part, I always kind of acknowledge that I don't intend to speak on behalf of communities at large, particularly given that many communities are and will be disproportionately and differently impacted by the climate crisis. It's nice to have opportunities like this to begin conversations with diverse audiences so we can begin to think of intersectional solutions. So having said that, I kind of tried to pick three main and key ingredients that can kind of help, but I think not an exhaustive list, and it's been great to hear from fellow panelists as to what their thoughts are as well. For me, I think one of the first ones is I often hear like unheard voices. I find like that's very offensive. These communities don't have opportunities to be involved because they're busy living their life, in the sense that not everybody, like to be able to engage on climate change, I consider a big privilege. People are living without basic income, secure housing. There are so many public health crises that are overlapping and intersecting. And it's urgent that we address these things alongside all of the other things, because community resiliency will not come. People cannot engage on climate change until everything else in their life is in a position for them to be able to engage with this issue. And I think that coming from my childhood, my lived experiences, like when I was living in a low income environment, we were just focusing on food, shelter, existing, surviving, thriving in our environment. This was not an issue that I could engage in as a community organizer even. So it's really important that we kind of reframe that discussion away from unheard voices to kind of intentionally, we're not making space for these people to be involved because we're not addressing some of the core issues that are at the heart of justice work, but that ties into that idea of climate justice, where if these are the same communities that are structurally vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, then we should be addressing all of these variety of issues as part of our climate action work, to ensure that no community goes left behind or unheard or unduly excluded. I think another tenet that ties into that for me is intersectionality, because as coined by the Black scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, this tenet kind of this framework, this way of thinking, this theory ties into the concept that we all are experiencing, different layers that intersect with our identities. And to me, being a neurodiverse woman of color, I see that there aren't that many people like me that I can, look up to. There are really not that many role models for me. Being also a youth, I see that this is important because not only are these perspectives that we bring in with these various identities important for shaping diverse policies away from the white hegemony, but it's also important from the perspective of knowing that there's community advocates at the leadership level that look like you, and that you will not be left behind. Like, we will do our best to ensure that your perspectives are included in a way that's safe, authentic, and ethical in the engagement when we engage with communities to co-design policies. And my third one is related to listening to youth. I know this theme will come up again, so I won't go off too much, but I think intergenerational learning is the key thing here. It's not just that we have to listen to youth exclusively or older people exclusively. It's this idea that we should see this as an intergenerational opportunity for horizontal learning, and really learning from each other. So the big thing being that I always say youth don't really have a stake in the game. This is not like a job for most of us. We're volunteering our time alongside everything else. Our only stake is our existence. So we'd like to have one and ensure the existence of our species. Having said that, there are so many lessons to learn from people that are more experienced in this field, whether it be from science or whether it be from community perspectives, lived experiences, traditional knowledge. And so with all those things coming together, I think listening, learning, unlearning, but making sure that we're doing so in a way that's really intentional and meaningful. And in terms of who should be leading this work, I think in large part, as I mentioned earlier, there is a need to counter the cis white hegemony, because there is such a concentration of power. There's such a concentration of that in the current power structures that are shaping policy at all levels, whether it be municipal, local, provincial, federal, but also within private public sector opportunities as well. And so in doing so, I think everything from knowledge generation to who is perceived as an expert authority. These are extensions of Western systems and Western kind of institutions and schools of thought, which have been helpful in many dimensions. You think about the vaccine and healthcare, but they're also limiting because they've gotten us to where we are in some ways as well. So there is this amazing untapped potential in having, women, two-spirit, gender diverse, neurodiverse, racialized, and Indigenous ways of thinking, knowing, and conceptualizing that have such a great potential for reimagining solutions. These perspectives have been marginalized in policy spaces, as many of the panelists have kind of touched on, and I know we'll touch on more. And so when centering this decolonized perspective, you can even go back to kind of, when we think about time and decolonizing time, the climate crisis can be traced back to colonization in many ways. This is something that many communities believe to be true in their experience. And coming from all that point, it isn't as much of a radical act as it sounds like. The divestment from the hegemony is not a radical act. It is a necessity at this point to be able to encompass those diverse views in an authentic way that isn't just like, we consulted stakeholders and then we're going to do what we want to do anyway. So maybe to put it differently, a genuine engagement into challenging the dominant narratives that we have within policy work, and trying to take a step back and think like, maybe there is a better way. Because we often find in scientific literature after the fact that some of these traditional ways of knowing are better. We've seen it with biodiversity, we've seen it with controlled burns, we've seen it in so many different ways. I can list so many that we'll do studies on later and say, yes, this traditional way of knowing was actually great. We should have been doing it the whole time anyway. So instead of being reactive to this, recognizing the legitimacy of other ways of knowing is really critical in reimagining policy solutions. And I'll end off, because I don't know how long I've been going, but I will end off. So in conclusion, when I think of the future, I think and I dream of abundance of time, resources, our relationship with the land and our communities, our access to green space, our health and well-being, our happiness, and more importantly, again, our existence as a species. I think by centering intersectionality, community-centered approaches, and calling the problem what it really is, an emergency, then creating policies that really reflect this urgency. These are all critical towards our path forward. So thank you so much for your time, and yeah, looking forward to more discussion.
Thanks so much, Mandy, and I appreciate you sort of making it personal, and I really like the way you framed sort of intergenerational learning and engagement. I think it's really powerful. It's really bringing together in ways that we can learn from each other. We're amazingly on time. Well done, panelists. And so now we do move into the question period, and I'm going to begin with a couple of questions that I'm going to ask. As many of you as want to participate, but we don't all have to participate on each one. The first one is about co-benefits, and being a little bit more concrete, if you can, about some of the co-benefits you see emerging if we move into this rapid and ambitious decarbonization. We're not talking about something gradual and contemplative as we did in the previous 30 years, as the generation, my generation, watched the climate change movement in that sort of gradual, but we're actually talking about something dramatic. So I'd love to hear a bit more about the co-benefits that you see emerging. And I'm not sure, Rachel, do you want to start, since you were talking about the economy, and that'll give the others a chance to also come in. So maybe I'll turn it over to you first.
Sure. So in terms of economic co-benefits, transition creates many economic opportunities. In our recent report, we identified 9 transition opportunity sectors where Canada already has companies that are active and successfully attracting investment in areas that will experience demand growth through transition. So those include low carbon electricity, such as renewables, low emission transport, including electric vehicles, batteries and energy storage, biofuels and bioproducts, clean hydrogen, building technology, mining technology, carbon capture and storage, and agriculture technology and plant proteins. These opportunities can generate better economic and societal outcomes if they offer good jobs, own source revenues for Indigenous communities, and new sources of investment across Canada. When we look at rural and remote communities, we will need to consider the types of investments that will be viable. They could include clean hydrogen, biofuels, renewable energy, and alternative proteins. However, these economic activities need to be done in ways that respect Indigenous rights, provide broad societal benefits, and do not exacerbate existing environmental challenges, including biodiversity and water use. So transition offers the opportunity to direct economic growth in directions that we want, generating a cleaner and more inclusive trajectory that will offer multiple environmental and social benefits. But many of these benefits will not happen on their own. So government intervention is needed to ensure that investment is channeled where it is needed and in ways that align with other policy objectives.
Thank you. All right. Does another panelist or a couple other panelists want to tackle this from either also an economic point of view or from a different point of view? Who's feeling most keen? You know, smile. Sarah, you're smiling. Let's go with you.
I'm always smiling. Yeah, great. So I do have a couple of thoughts, just brief ones. You know, picking up on what I heard, Mary and from Memby in particular, about what this looks like locally. And I think that that's where a lot of the co-benefits kind of become material and become tangible. And so, you know, when I think about the transitions that our communities are already undergoing, I mean, we have to keep in mind that transformations are happening at, you know, under our feet, whether we like it or not. And some of them we'd view as potentially positive and some of them negative. So we're aiming for a transition that we desire, that's desirable and not calamitous. So, but nonetheless, I picture the community around me, and I was born and raised in Manitoba, and I spent several years in Alberta and 10 years in Vancouver before living here for the last 8. So, you know, my view of what communities look and feel like has a couple of different flavors. But what I really appreciate about the transition to a low carbon resilient economy is that there's so much work that I think should and could be done in our communities to make them more livable, to improve our public health so that we have more space to be outside, to reintegrate nature through our communities in a way that enhances biodiversity. We know that we're in the midst of a biodiversity crisis as well as a climate change crisis. And because, you know, as our communities become, as our population becomes increasingly urban, we need to use those urban tools to address multiple crises simultaneously. So, you know, weaving nature through our cities can sink carbon, can enhance biodiversity, can offer us a place to play and improve our own mental and physical health. Nature-based solutions or ecosystem-based strategies, or, you know, however we want to describe green infrastructure, I think poses really important opportunities for doing adaptation and mitigation simultaneously and trying to access some of those co-benefits. So perhaps we could talk more about that as we go. But those are just some of the ideas that I sort of see around me in the communities that, at least.
Can I
Another
jump in?
panelist? Graham, I saw you taking notes. I think you want to answer it, don't you?
Yeah, that would be great, and really appreciate everybody's contributions. I think one thing that I'd start out with is just the recognition that rapid and ambitious decarbonization can't replicate the same inequitable system that we operate in currently. And so part of that, I think, acknowledges, for example, rising income inequality as a central challenge to what we need to navigate collectively as a society, especially as it connects to Manvi's point about the overwhelmingly privileged nature of climate discussions currently. And in that line, it's really about, in my mind, also tax fairness and tax justice, and how do we think about using these mechanisms to challenge the system of thinking that we seem to operate in, that really just comes down to valuing certain things, creating environments of scarcity, and requiring us to compete for you know, small pots of funding. And I use that to just illustrate, for example, Sarah's point. One thing that I don't want us to be in is a scenario where, you know, because of government or other decisions, we're all competing over similar pots of funding, which is how adaptation and mitigation funding occurs currently. And so hopefully through some of those structural changes, we can also then think about, you know, what are those systems of imagining that we, you know, collectively have thought about. And for me, it really comes down to, you know, how do we, even through the framing of co-benefits, reproduce that way of thinking that puts values and commodifies things around us and the relationships that we have. And that's not to say like these things aren't important and we need to think about it as part of driving the transition, but it's also about how do we take a step back and ensure that our central tenet of decarbonization is also to prevent additional harm. And I'm aspirational for that just, equitable, and resilient future, but at a core, I think we need to prevent harm, and that's inclusive of ongoing harm to individuals, to communities, but also to the land around us. And hopefully that harm reduction and then that harm prevention is central to, how we think about the ways in which we, seek to avoid the reproduction of decision-making and systems of decision-making that got us here in the first place.
Okay, thanks. Manvi and Mary, you want in a little bit on the conversation? Yeah, okay. Well, I'll let Manvi go first since she was last time. Go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, this co-benefits framing is something that's used in public health and health systems type work a lot. And it's usually seen as something that's one of the most convincing arguments for health related fields to be engaging in climate discussions, because oftentimes it's seen as something that's so environmental that it's been hard to legitimize in the public health space. And so my master's thesis was on, and it's really interesting how politicized this topic is for health people to work in. And I say health people, health sector actors, if you want to be official, what I used in my thesis. But this concept is, people feel very, they have to almost justify so strongly why there is a need to address this to then have a resulting impact on communities' health, well-being, generally population health. I find that to be kind of funny and kind of silly in some ways, that we need to work so hard to make climate change seem like a health crisis problem as well. But it is what it is, I guess. It's currently the state of the situation for sure, from the people that I've spoken to in the public health sector, in particular in Ontario. Having said that, I mean, we know for a fact that so many different communities will be disproportionately impacted. And so co-benefits help the population's health. Like, active transport is great for physical activity. We have access to green space is good for mental health. Like, there are very legitimate pathways between, navigating like the co-benefits, good for the environment, good for your well-being. Something that I think is really interesting in this conversation is also this idea that when we have co-benefit framing, many people think that the public health frame for climate change is one of the most impactful ways to convince those that have this value action gap, where they might say that they care about climate change, but they don't actually do anything from the mitigation or adaptation side, whether it be on an individual level or as a group affiliation. And so all that to say is this framing is very impactful and helpful to help address and mitigate that gap that we see between people caring and people actually doing something about this problem. But all that to say, I kind of do tend to agree with what Graham said about the framing has its own limitations. And in my experience with it, it's one of many tools we should use, but it really isn't the only way to look at the problem. But it is a helpful way to look at it, because for those people that are maybe so removed from seeing the interconnections and multi-system aspects of climate change, and also seeing the systems levels solutions that are required to address it, this is kind of your first foray into the problem. And it's an easy way to get people to begin to see how complicated and complex this issue is. So those are just a few thoughts on co-benefits from the public health side. But it is all that to say, it is definitely something that I see a lot in health literature as ways to convince, and something that is easy to kind of translate to the policy space more than other ways. And it's really convincing for those in policymaking spaces who might not be able to make those connections, because not all policymakers have specialized knowledge of, again, every single system involved in climate change work. So.
Okay, thanks, Manvi. Mary. I think you're muted, Mary.
Oh, okay.
There, you're on now. You're good.
I'm on now.
You're okay now. Yep.
Thanks. I think this is a really important conversation because there's all kinds of assumptions. We use these terms and stuff. We need to be clear about them. And so I'm really appreciating this dialogue. But one of the things I guess I might just offer is, well, two things. One is that, there's really an equity lens that has to be put on a co-benefit. So we can create all kinds of co-benefits, that'd be great. But we have to ask, well, who's going to get them? And who's going to pay for them, and are there any harms? So so that's one comment, is that we have to integrate the co-benefits and equity lenses together. And then the other thing is sometimes we chat about it in my sphere as we've been thinking about this, and as I said, we're using metrics to try and get integrated design of co-benefits into the climate actions. And then we say, well, what if we were the co-benefit? What if the action is about affordable housing? And one of the co-benefits is carbon reduction. And I think that's a very powerful way of it really just puts forward this forefronting of community concerns issue I was mentioning before, is that what if we're fitting in and supporting, something that's really come out as a really important community concern that relates to these issues that are being mentioned, this widening gap between rich and poor, this housing affordability issue, certainly in my realm of service, which is Canadian cities. This is a hugely difficult issue. How can we think about that and consider how we can fit into that rather than the other way around?
With your indulgence, I'm going to go to one of the questions from that are coming in from our audience today, and then we'll come back to the other theme that I was really wanting to explore, which has to do with promising progress. But I just want to take the first question here. It's really about food, and so the question talks about weather disasters, highlighting how it's interfering with our ability to feed ourselves and others, and what's pointed out is the lost livestock in BC, but there's also lost food from all kinds of other weather disasters. And so the question is, what does this transition look like from a food point of view and from our feeding of our peoples? Anybody want to wade in on that one? I've got, all right, Manvi, go first, please. Yes.
I'll say something briefly to just kind of kick off the discussion, but being here, something that I didn't know was that I'm in what is currently Vancouver, and I didn't know this, but 50% of our dairy comes from Abbotsford, which is underwater. So, something like that, what it brings to mind is that in the literature I've read, for years I've read, nutritional deficiencies as a result of diet changes because of crop scarcity, or, inefficiencies in, supply chain to grocery store, and all these pathways of getting food to people. And what's interesting is being here when these implications are very much urgently happening, and realizing that the crisis is already here, obviously, and it's been here in the global south and in other regions of from a global context already, obviously, but being so close to home, it's an interesting conceptualization to see, in the worst way, the literature and practice that there will be impacts on nutritional deficiencies, in diet changes, in access to culturally safe and secure foods for certain communities, if that's the implication on their traditional diets. There's going to be a number of impacts on mental health as a result, because not to make light of the situation, but cheese cheese is a big concern for me. But no, in all seriousness, this situation is quite dire, and realizing the gravity of it, being here and learning about it firsthand, is really sad, to say the least, about how I've been feeling about it. So if that's only going to continue to happen, there needs to be such an urgent inquiry into the implications on all levels about the impact on our well-being holistically, I think. So that's just a few of my thoughts.
Yeah, and it's interesting because even the pandemic had people hoarding food and being worried about it. And of course, we've known for a long time that food security in the north has been an issue, and of course that's not just related to climate weather events, but to a whole host of other things. Are there others who have got some thoughts they want to share around this food security theme? Okay, please, Rachel, and then Graham.
Yeah, food is an area where it is that intersection between adaptation and mitigation, and it is also really a global issue. So it has multiple facets that need to be addressed, and it is really one of those things that needs to be thought about in an integrated way. When we look globally about what a changing climate is going to do to food production around the world, a lot of countries look to Canada as potentially being a significant source of food production in the decades to come. But then at the same time, agriculture is a significant source of greenhouse gas emissions in Canada as well, and faces its own adaptation challenges, as Manvi said. So, how to manage that transition in a way that provides the food around the world that is needed, that is consistent with our own domestic net zero goals, and to provide the supports that the agricultural system in Canada needs to really adapt to the changing climate we're going to see here.
Emma, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I wanted to just add something and actually read a quote from an elder that I work with, mostly because I think this is an incredibly important question. And actually, as I was alluding to in our standalone report as part of the National Climate Assessment, one of our 5 key messages is focused on the centrality of food and its connection to, in an Indigenous perspective, to who we are as people. And I thought maybe if you'll beg your indulgence, I'll read this just quickly and try to avoid the tendency for my voice to be as monotone as possible. So this is from an elder from Funtukwitchin. Many of you may know Norma Cassie, and she shared this quote with us as part of our report, and says, "Traditional food is not just nourishment for the body, but also for the community. It's the knowledge of the past and also understanding of what's to come. It's also the traditions surrounding hunting, harvesting, gathering, and fishing for that food, the ceremony involved in honoring Mother Earth and what she has provided. It's the drying and the preserving of food for hard times coming, and it's the preparing the food for eating, for sharing. Consumption is the last step along that chain within the food system." And eating traditional food systems is important. It keeps us strong and provides critical nourishment, but it's only one part of the meaning of food for our people. And I think that really encapsulates that cultural identity perspective of food that that's often not that it's not discussed, but that's central to this question of food security and sovereignty.
May I jump in just with one added reflection there, that just, when this brings me back to our initial conversations about the need for a diversity of visions of the future, because food is central to that vision of the future, what our lives actually look and taste like in 30 or 50 years, and what we have access to and how we prepare it and with whom we prepare it. I mean, food is this incredible, magnifier or distillation of the cultural dimensions of climate change and the economic dimensions of climate change and the behavior. And it's a very rich area, I think, where we can discuss, both the impact of our individual actions, but collectively what our food cultures, plural, are and how those might shift in the future. And, I see very acrimonious kind of accusatory debates when it comes to what food choices we should make or how we should, behave differently in a changing climate. And whenever conversations unfold, I think we would do well to expand our idea of, to sort of have a more inclusive view of all the different ways that food plays out in our lives and how culturally significant it is. And I just think that would be a much more humane and inclusive and appropriate way of talking about what sustainable futures could look like.
Thank you. Mary, do you want in on this one, or do you want me to go to the next one and you can tackle it?
Why don't we go to the next one?
Okay, well, I'm going to go to the a more positive theme. I'm hoping you can share with our audience some promising progress toward a just transition, stories, examples, maybe a partnership. But love to hear some some things that give us hope. And I think we were talking before we went live on camera that we could have talked about COP, and we said, well, that might, the latest COP may not give us hope. So I'm hoping now you can focus on some stories that do give us hope about the transition. And so Mary, why don't I start with you then?
Thank you, Jean. I did mention earlier that there's an example that has come to my mind. It's a partnership between a local environmental group in Toronto Environmental Alliance, and 2 community hubs in what we call priority neighborhoods in Toronto facing a lot of challenges. And it's been about 4 years of relationship building now with these parties. It started with a study, which I remember that TAF funded, when we were asking leaders in these community hubs, which are in neighborhoods with a lot of new immigrants, high populations who have challenging with access to food, jobs, other things in their lives that make their lives challenging. And we were going to ask them, do you want to work on climate issues? And I was thinking, surely not, surely this will be the last thing on anybody's list if you're you don't have transportation and there's all kinds of other issues in their life. But I was wrong. And in fact, the leaders in these community hubs, they came from places in the world where the impacts of climate change were much more severe, and they were aware of that. They also know that the climate impacts are going to hit their communities the hardest, and they're ready to take a leadership role. And so building on this, we provided some support for them over a couple of years to tell us how they wanted to lead on climate action. And the results has been really fascinating, and what kind of support they need. These are clearly coming to the focus, I think, to the fore as incredible portals for grassroots leadership and voice. And they do need kinds of some support and assistance. And this group has created a report based on their experience over 2 years about how we can better support what I would call these pieces of social infrastructure. They're right in neighborhoods. By the way, throughout this period of study, COVID happened. And so these hubs were provided critical support in terms of food access, service access. They are really important. They prove themselves as critically important pieces of resilience infrastructure. And so in terms of mitigation, adaptation, and response in crisis, these are very important types of organizations. And I guess I would say I'm seeing that they're revealing their interest and capacity in working in this area and bringing new policy and amplifying the existing voices. As Mandy said, these voices are not absent. They just really haven't been properly invited or given access. And these groups can help provide that in a way that is impossible to do, for example, from City Hall. Okay, so this is, these are activating these kinds of groups in the community. So I'll leave it there, but it's, to me, that's a very inspiring story of how groups from different sectors work together in a respectful way to teach one another how to highlight and lift up some of these important pieces of infrastructure, which in fact are already there, and we're just underutilizing them.
Thank you, Mary. It is very positive. Sarah, do you have any things you can share with us in this way?
Yeah, I'd like to bring up a group of, I'll use your word, Mandy, a group of actors that we don't often talk about, or that we don't talk about enough, I think, in the transitions discussion, which is small businesses. So I work a lot with small businesses to understand why they might be motivated to experiment with sustainability and to advance their progress. And typically as a group, they have been viewed as quite conservative, and they have, very fine profit margins and not a lot of resources to take radical steps towards decarbonizing. But I and my team, we work in communities in several countries, trying to understand exceptional small businesses that do really cool stuff. And I guess my main point is that what I'm seeing as more deeply transformative in sustainable small firms is not sort of incremental efficiency changes, you know, like reducing their energy use or their water use or their waste production just slightly. You know, what my old colleague and friend John Robinson would say, you know, doing just slightly less bad. They're doing something much deeper than that. They're adjusting their underlying model to rethink role in society is. What should a small business do for us, you know, in terms of producing environmental value, social good, and profit alongside. And so there's thousands of examples like that, but they're small and they're not the big heavy hitters, the large transnational corporations that have the greenhouse gas emissions of a small country, but collectively they're crucial. And so I think a really important transition discussion writ large will be, how do we and accelerate that kind of deeper sustainability innovation in small firms? And we're seeing them do it. We're seeing small firms that, you know, in Vancouver, that enhance food security by teaching local kids how to grow a garden, food back to and creating skills and jobs in the process. We're seeing social enterprises that have grown up in the wake of the quake to build in those vacant spaces, garden cafes and maker spaces that actually bring communities together and create benefit on all of those levels. So I think those are really promising seeds being planted of a just transition.
Okay, thank you. Mandy, you want to go next? Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I think for me, a big like place of like hope, I guess, just the positive note and progress is like never before have we seen young people so engaged in politics and policy work. It's really exciting. You know, I'm climate policy lead at UBC Climate Hub, and to me, it's so wonderful that I'm in a place now. I've been involved in community organizing since I was 11. And I've never before had so many spaces to be authentically myself, but also like try to counter the imposter syndrome of being a young person trying to sound like I know what I'm doing, even though I do know what I'm doing. It's just been difficult in so many spaces. We weren't really given opportunities to be, you know, influential actors in shaping our futures. And we will be experiencing the effects of this crisis for our whole lifetime. And we were born into this crisis. So if there's any case to be made about how much agency we deserve in these conversations, it's a lot. You know, we really didn't create majority of the problem, or we're not a part of the decisions leading into a majority of the problems that we see today, yet we have to deal with it the longest. So for me, it's exciting to see so many places where there's an intentional inclusion of young people. There's so many radical spaces. Even my organization, founding it, we're 40 under 30-year-olds and we just every opportunity we get to just do policy work for us is exciting. So I think it's in some ways there's this perception that youth are disengaged, and I would definitely say that that's not the case, but it's exciting that we're in a time where we are so mobilized on this issue that I think there is something to be hopeful for, because we're working on it very intentionally. So yeah.
Thanks, Mandy. I just have to tell you that, at least from my experience, the imposter syndrome never goes away, because if you're humble in the face of what you don't know and you're eager to make a difference, it never really leaves you. At least that's been my experience. So we learn to live with it even as we go forward. Rachel, I wonder if you have anything you could share with us.
When we think about capturing opportunities through transition, which is going to be an important part of that just transition, is generating new sources of jobs, new sources of income and growth. I would give the example of something Quebec has done recently, which is investing over $3 billion in purchasing over 2,000 electric buses. It's interesting that they have decided to use government investment power to generate demand for something that they produce in Quebec. They have a number of electric bus manufacturers. So generating that demand locally helps secure those investments, helps to grow those companies and create new jobs, while also offering significant greenhouse gas benefits and air pollution benefits. We know that diesel-powered vehicles in cities are some of the worst sources of air pollution, causing significant health impacts, and particularly on those that use the bus system most often, which tends to be youth, who are more vulnerable, as well as low-income people. So that type of initiative, while may seem like it's purely a greenhouse gas objective, has multiple benefits in a number of areas.
Thank you. And, if you've ever been to Shenzhen in China, where it's the electric vehicle sort of capital, and all their buses went electric, early on. And it was the same kind of thing. They were part of an economic investment in their workforce, but also part of a transition. It's these concrete examples of change are everywhere around us. It's exciting. Graham, do you want to come in on this conversation?
Yeah, just minor, and really appreciate all the really inspiring examples that were shared. I guess I'll return to where Norma is from, Old Crow, Yukon, in a place called the Vantakwichin, where the most northern First Nation in all of Canada. And several years ago, in 2019, they were the first of any Indigenous group across the country to declare a climate emergency. And in that declaration of a climate emergency, like I indicated in my opening, they extended that emergency to the plants and to the animals and to the other relatives around, and then use that as a place to catalyze action. And one of the commitments that they've made is to go entirely net zero by 2030. They're a community that's highly dependent on diesel generation, and have successfully actually just launched, I think it was several months ago, one of the largest solar projects in the Arctic, displacing more than a quarter of their diesel emissions. And their chief, Dana Tisha Tram, is maintaining that progress to entirely displacing all of the diesel that is trucked up through, well, flown up or trucked during the summer in the next coming years. And so I thought that was just a useful example, and to reflect on what everybody's been sharing. I think there are many transformative examples occurring across the country and across the world. The challenge is just making sure that those examples can continue to confront these kind of political or bureaucratic inertia that prevent that rapid and ambitious transformation. And I think we can always continue to highlight those examples, but we also need that institutional change to start acknowledging what everybody around this virtual circle, shared already, and then start to create the enabling policy environments where we begin to unpack some of those kind of structural constraints on communities across the country.
It does speak to the power of a word. When we began to use the word emergency, things changed, just as they have when we speak of systemic racial injustices and other things. It's amazing sometimes how one or two or three words can mobilize us forward. So it's yeah, and that's where there's hope. We do have another question that's come in. This one is really about sort of the new jobs, I would say, as a highlight. So the question talks first about how some of the jobs that will be displaced in this transition are related to the extractive industries, related to the energy intensive industries, and how many of those jobs are male dominated. But the question goes on to say, but what we saw in the pandemic, a she session, we saw often female workers disadvantaged. And so the question is really about how we can ensure a transition, particularly for our energy systems, is going to create opportunities for the broadest swath of people as possible. I don't know if anybody can compute that quickly enough to respond. Rachel, you've got something. Great. Thank you.
Well, there's a few things. I mean, in some ways, the best solution for those large emissions intensive companies is for those companies themselves to transition. So if they can move into new sources of opportunity, such as clean hydrogen or biofuels or carbon capture and storage technology as a service, that will help them retain a certain amount of employment. But regardless of how well those companies transition, there's likely to be job loss as a result of automation and just an overall contraction in demand within that sector. So then you're left with, well, what are the new sectors that are going to come in, and how do we ensure that those are the growth in jobs that are created is as inclusive as possible? And one of the things that we've talked about in our report is the use of what's called ESG reporting, so environmental, social, and governance reporting, and thinking about the types of metrics that the companies are required to report and what those reflect. And right now, a lot of that ESG conversation is missing some elements, and Indigenous performance of companies is one of those that is a huge gap for Canadian companies. So if those companies are required under various reporting regimes to be more inclusive in their hiring practices, as well as their partnerships, the contracts that they provide, that can help ensure that that growth is inclusive.
Who else? I've got Mary first. Yeah, please.
Well, just again, this is a complex system, but I guess we could say that we could be thinking about new energy systems as being more distributed, more redundant, more resilient. Like, in Ontario, we have big giant plants with one giant transmission line. I mean, these are not particularly resilient. And if we could think about new energy systems that talk about, district energy systems, about multiple kinds of energy sources that are integrated into a very sophisticated utility system that's brand new. It just creates a whole new vision of what the energy system could look like. There's storage elements, repair and maintenance, prosumer. So you're producing on your house, you're a consumer and a producer. And that's all linked into our electric vehicle batteries that can be used on demand as needed as backup energy in our homes or in our communities. It's a much more sophisticated vision of what energy production is all about. And I think it creates a lot more opportunities for more types of people to participate. So I'll just offer that reflection. There's just a little strand of, what kind of energy system, and these kinds of resilient and small and neighborhood-based systems, they give more innovation and more ways to access power. Same goes for that food question. Like, we're getting 50% of our milk from one place. Maybe we should be thinking about ensuring we hedge our bets on where we get these very important resources, power, food. Should they be coming from large single sources, or we should be working really hard at this concept of distributed? And I think there's benefits to that in terms of access to jobs associated with that type of approach.
Mary. Any others?
Maybe I can.
Yep. Manvi, please, and then Graham. Okay, go ahead, Manvi.
You. Yeah, I mean, I guess something that came to my mind is that I think two things. One is that I think young people are really excited for this because we don't, I think there is a cognitive dissonance sometimes when we enter the job market. We know that there's a crisis and sometimes we have to do jobs for a livable, to live that aren't aligned with our values. We do want to work in a just economy, and a sustainable economy with, particularly when it comes to energy. I think that also translates to so many of the current workers. I believe I read a report that did surveys of people that work in oil and gas right now, and so many of them are open to the transition. And I think that a big part of it is supporting them in that transition. And I think that very common solutions that are recommended by so many community leaders on this topic is providing the trainings, providing the social supports that are needed to be able to make that transition and make it an easy transition for the people who it's going to be hardest for. Like if you are economically, disadvantaged, or even just in a position where economically you rely on this job, it's got to be, top down to make it easy for everybody else to be able to do that. I don't think that there is a lack of interest in a just transition from people that are working in these industries. It's more just if it's feasible for them. So I think that from all accounts from my end, I think that it's something that everybody is really looking forward to. And I think Rachel touched on some tangible ways that it can actually happen, but it's definitely going to be meaningful and, again, a necessity. So just got to do it somehow, some way. And it might look different in different communities, but it's got to happen. So.
Okay, thanks, Graham.
Appreciate that point. And I guess I reflect on this question as I responded to the first kind of opening remarks. And, the kind of broad focal point around a just and equitable transition as being central to the conversation. But I guess what I'm struck by is the broader conversation about addressing un- and underemployment across the country. And I think, those things need to be framed in kind of simultaneous ways where, we talk about the broader context where, and Rachel shared some like really confronting statistics about, especially, for example, the underrepresentation of First Nations in the broader economy, the completion of high school and post-secondary, et cetera. And so, I see this as something, and, Mary framed it really well, the forefront of the addressing of those under and unemployed, and really the benefits for the just transition is central to that, recognizing that, there is a component of folks, and one of the things that Canada does really poorly is supporting on-the-job training, and even on the job and transitioning in that training. And so, if we're thinking about what's necessary to retrain and reskill folks, we also need to think about like what are the institutional and social security supports that are required to enable that, and while at the same time I feel like I'm putting forward all these like disconnected but central pieces. The case for a guaranteed livable income or a universal basic income that helps us address those sorts of vast inequalities across the country and within our economies that really play out in the conversations about how the just transition is currently represented and who's going to be the main beneficiaries of that and who prospectively would be left out of that.
Okay, thank you. Now we're pretty much out of time, but Sarah, you were the first speaker. So if you have a less than a moment comment and you want to be the last speaker to get in on this conversation, I'll give you that one moment.
Well, in 15 seconds or fewer, I would just say that, if we're talking about when it comes to the impacts of climate change and the impetus or the urgency, but I do think a global lens really here, and we know that climate change impacts women much more powerfully than others, and that's because of a lack of resources and limited access to education, and they're less likely to own property and this kind of thing. So those impacts are not equally distributed, and so in our solutions we have to take into account those underlying structural drivers of vulnerability, so that, to come back to what we said at the very beginning of this panel, so that the benefits of transition are more equally shared, and we're pushing towards something, that future that we desire, that is actually different from what we have today.
Okay, well, thank you so much, and thank you to all those who are with us. Thank you, of course, to our 5 panelists. You've been tremendous. You represent different parts of society. We've got nonprofit, we've got academic, we've got we discussed businesses, we've got Indigenous think tanks. So thank you for coming together, and you had many lenses that you shared with us, and I think it just what's left with me thinking is that, you know, we're on the road to the most important thing that we can do collectively as a world community. And so, so let's sort of continue with our quest for a just and inclusive transition. Again, thanks for being with us.